So today's lecture, like I said, I'm continuing to talk about history of Rome, mostly dealing with the late Roman Republic. So we'll get into, of course, today. Mostly I'll talk about the Punic Wars, and then we'll get into the aftermath of the Punic Wars with the decline of the Republic and the rise of the dictators. I'll get to that, like maybe we'll get to some of the dictators like Gaius Marius, etc. Let's talk about, of course, lecture-wise, what I've got at this point. Let me show you. Of course, I'm using the same PowerPoint lecture we had before. So I think there's going to be a new one coming up I will have later, of course, which will be on the Empire. But yeah, we're continuing talking about the Punic Wars right now. I'll expand this for you. Yeah, like I said, Punic Wars, we've kind of just talked about the background of it so far. We've covered, I guess, just talking about what the causes of the wars were. And I think I talked about the advantages and the differences between Rome and Carthage in the previous lecture. What I didn't talk about was the writers, like the different Roman writers that of course, wrote about the wars. I'll kind of go into that and talk about that first before I really get into discussing, each of the different wars that were fought later. Now, if you know about the Punic Wars, Rome won all the three wars. So you know how the story goes that the victor writes the history, right? So there's only like this Roman view, I guess, of what happened in the Punic Wars. And so most of the history of the Punic Wars are written by mostly several writers that are, still well known today. Of course, the most famous that wrote about the Punic Wars was the Roman author I told you about named Livy. They called him Titus Livius. Everybody called him Livy for short in the West. Now I've got a list of them here for you for later. You want to look them up or whatever. But Polybius, that one is actually the older source. Polybius was a writer writing about the 2nd century BC. It's about almost 2,200 years ago. He's got a series of books that are called the Histories of Polybius. So that one is the one that really goes back the furthest. It's probably more accurate, some of the stuff he has. Now, like I said, Livy is, of course, in his History of Rome I told you about, we discussed, I think, last week, has, of course, a series of books which mostly cover the Second Punic War. So he kind of goes into detail about that. They often call that book the War of Hannibal. That's one of the nicknames that they usually called it. So I think him and Polybius are pretty good. And Appian was a later writer, a Roman writer writing, I think around, I want to say the time of Emperor Trajan, which would be like 2nd century CE or AD. He's like a little later. I think Livy was writing about the time of Augustus, so that would put him about 2,000 years ago. But Appian's like a little bit later. So I think his is less reliable, maybe. He's got a book that's called Roman History or Historia Romana, which is just the Latin name of it. So it's like the third book that was also, written as well. So all these different authors that wrote about it. And some of it's, of course, romanticized, some of it's exaggerated, maybe, about what happened. But obviously, you don't get really a Carthaginian perspective of the war because they lost the war. And of course, their state got annihilated, if you know about this, by the Romans. So, all right, so let's get into, of course, the Punic Wars. Now, they had, like I said, 3 Punic Wars. The first Punic War was the longest, which went from 264 to 241. You saw in the video that mostly the first Punic War was fought over predominantly Sicily. In fact, that's what caused the Punic Wars to actually break out, was over, in fact, I've got it right here, excuse me. It actually broke out over Sicily. Sicily was an important area because it's kind of between Italy and Africa. And so the Romans saw it as a chance to take over Sicily and maybe control the Mediterranean Sea. And then from there, hop over and start taking over Africa. Then, of course, the Carthaginians saw it as, the opposite, where they could, continue to control the Mediterranean Sea, then maybe hop over to, obviously, take control of Italy, vice versa there. Yeah, it was also a naval conflict, which is definitely true about that. And at the beginning of the war, I think I told you that the Carthaginians had a bigger navy, like 500 ships that they had. And of course, they relied more on mercenaries, which we'll see later they do. So that was definitely an advantage they had. And of course, I told you that the Romans didn't really have much of a navy at all. They had more of a land army and stuff like that. Real big army too. They had, so they really weren't, prepared, I guess, to fight a naval war with the Carthaginians. And what happened, they say, during the war was that the Romans were able to capture Carthaginian ships that I think had been damaged or sunk or whatever, or partially sunk, that they found. They began copying. They actually took them apart and brought them back to Italy, and they began building their own ships, which I think led to the so-called quinquereme, I think they call it later. So the Romans began developing their own navy. And you may have heard the story about the Roman Navy. They fitted their vessels with this new apparatus they created called the corvus. I think corvus meant in Latin raven or crow. That's what it means. And it's this boarding device, which Polybius claims was about 36 feet long, about. And when they would come along a ship, like an enemy ship, they would throw the landing board down on the other ship and then race over and basically seize the ship, take over it, basically. So they could basically turn, like, I guess, you could turn naval battles and land battles, in a sense, by being able to do that as well. And I guess they also probably had, rams on the front where they could ram ships and stuff like that. And that played kind of a major role because by the end of the First Punic War, what happened was the Romans ended up defeating the Carthaginians. They basically broke the back of the Carthaginian navy, which was never the same after that. And so from there, by the 241, the Romans were able to basically take control of Sicily, which fell to them. And then later they did take over also afterwards, which is to the west of Italy, upper part of the Mediterranean and all that. Sardinia and Corsica, those fell too as well. And so you start to see Rome starting to conquer territory outside of Italy. So really the first areas that the Romans, take over are really islands that are in the Mediterranean Sea. And this enables the Romans to control a lot of the Western Mediterranean, and their navy will eventually dominate the Mediterranean for several centuries after that. So that was initially what happened in the First Punic War. But the first Punic War it's just not that famous compared to the later two. The second one and the Third Punic Wars, of course, that followed later, which I, of course, will be getting into. Now, kind of talk a little bit what happened after the First Punic War. Between the First and Second Wars, what occurred was that they talked about in that little short video about Hamilcar. Hamilcar, of course, the father of Hannibal, which they mentioned about. He was really their best general in the First Punic War. Fought mostly on Sicily. And what he did was he crossed from Africa, he crossed the Mediterranean to Spain between the wars, and they basically took control of what is Spain. They began colonizing it, taking it over. Which you see in that red area on the bottom of Spain in Western Europe. And the Carthaginians dubbed it New Carthage. You see there, which you can see, I think, became one of their main cities that was on the east coast of Spain today. And over time, what happened was Hamilcar died of, I think, old age, and his son eventually took over from him in Spain. And Hannibal would go on to be one of the greatest generals of all time, not just the greatest Carthaginian type general, but he was considered to be one of the top generals in ancient times. He could probably pretty much, spoke in the same breath with men like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Scipio Africanus, probably Gaius Marius, who was a great Roman general. And of course, it says there, he was also the father of military strategy. That was one thing that he was really known for. Hannibal, which I believe I've got some pictures of if you want to look at him. But Hannibal was a man of who used a lot of military tactics. He didn't just try to, attack an enemy right up the gut, that kind of deal. He really tried to use tactics and fight war like it was like chess, trying to move men around the right spot to defeat an enemy. And so it might be like flanking maneuvers. It might be like a encirclement maneuver that Hannibal invented pretty much overall. And the Romans were really scared of Hannibal. In fact, they were so fearful of Hannibal, even when he was dead. Like he'd been dead for years. They thought he might come back, I guess. He was kind of like the what they call a boogeyman. You know what a boogeyman is? Like a ghost in the closet or maybe under your bed when you're a little kid. That's the kind of thing that people felt about Hannibal. And it was an old Roman saying that they used to say, which a lot of times they would say it like the parents would say it to their kids or something like that. If they wouldn't go to bed or they were being bad, they would say, Hannibal's at the gates. And they'd run away. Of course, the Latin is Hannibal ad portas also as well. It's a very famous saying that's been around. So yeah, Hannibal is very feared. He's really the closest, I guess, man that really, at least back in those days, came to really destroying the Roman state at the time. And I'll get into, of course, the Second Punic Wars, but the Second Punic Wars were very bloody. In fact, all the Punic Wars were really bloody. I think I forget the number exactly of the casualties total for all the wars, but it was a few million, maybe like a 1 or 2 million. I think is what it really amounts to today. So yeah, 1 to 2 million deaths, may have been the amount that occurred in both the First, Second, and Third Punic Wars overall. I don't know what the casualties with that too. I mean, if you add that in, it's got to be even more, like double or more. If you think about it, I don't know what would be the next bloody war after that. I think maybe the Gallic Wars, I think, were pretty bloody also, which Caesar was involved in, Julius Caesar, later in France. Now, what was the cause of the Second Punic War? Well, the cause of the Second Punic War was over Spain. If you go back to that map I just showed you. So now you've got the Carthaginians moving in here, this red area. And the Romans have allies that actually live in part of Spain. Like Saguntum was actually a city that was ruled by the Greeks. It had been founded there. And they were kind of an ally of Rome. And so Hannibal and the Carthaginians felt like they didn't belong there. Like this is all should be, Carthaginian territory. And so that's one of the main things of why the Punic War broke out, because of, basically, again, conflict over territory again, just like, what happened with Sicily right there. So what happened was Hannibal, like it said in the video, went on the offensive, of course. And what he did was he eventually laid siege. He actually attacked Saguntum. I think it was at 219. He attacked it and laid siege to it from 219 to about 218. And then I think took the city. And then after he did that, that sparked the war with the Romans. The Romans declared war on him. And at that point, the Romans were going to get ready to send an army over there to attack him in Spain. However, we saw in the video, Hannibal decided that he was going to, try to, preemptively strike at them first, instead of, before them, the Romans coming to attack him, more or less. And so what happened was Hannibal went on the offensive in 218 BC and marched his forces eastward into through what is Spain, into France, and then into northern Italy with a huge army, of course, which involved infantry, cavalry, and even brought war elephants with him. You saw in the video. which were kind of terrifying to the Romans. The Romans had never really fought elephants before. And one of the things that Hannibal did, which was very, very, very famous, of course, was that he eventually crossed the Alps with a huge army. I think lost like 50,000 is how many he got through. I thought he had 100,000 originally, but he lost like half of them going through the mountains, believe it or not. And so he crossed the Alps in the wintertime, which nobody had ever done before. And at that point, he came down into northern Italy. Surprise, I'm here, basically. And I think he first attacked the Po River Valley, is correct, about that, smashing into North Italy. In the first two battles, which were very decisive, the Romans suffered heavy casualties, like I think over 100,000 men that were killed and wounded. At the Battle of Trebia, 218, that should be Lake Tresimeno, Tresimeno. That's what it should be spelled, actually, Tresimeno. And the Romans, of course, came up with different tactics to try to defeat Hannibal. There was a general who was a Roman consul at the time named Fabius. You've heard of it, it's called Fabius Maximus. What Fabius wanted to do, he thought that attacking Hannibal was just suicide because Hannibal was just, his military tactics were superior to the Romans. The Romans had more forces. He wanted to do more of a delaying tactic, using guerrilla type tactics, even use like scorched earth kind of things against Hannibal. But a lot of the Romans thought he was a coward. They called him Fabius the Delayer. He's trying to delay the war, and you're a coward, and we ought to go form a huge army and try to fight Hannibal, toe to toe, instead of doing this kind of silly stuff, more or less. Of course, later they'd regret it, about this, and I think it brought him back later and said, "Hey, we better do this," that kind of thing. So what the Romans decided to do, like I said, they went on the offensive. This was in 216 BC. And these two other consuls who were generals, Gaius Vero and Lucius Paulus, they amassed basically what is a huge army, which had about 16 legions. A legion has about 4,800 men in it. So that amounts to something like 80,000 or more men that were basically in this huge army. And what they were going to try to do is going to try to trap Hannibal in the southern part of Italy. And so in August 216, they think the date was August the 2nd, the Battle of Cannae was fought. And I think I've got a map showing you where it is. It's kind of on the bottom of Italy, near the heel. I don't know if you know about Italy. It looks like a boot, if you know about that. And so you got the heel down here. And so it's like on the Adriatic Sea. It's about where the Romans tried to trap Hannibal's force right here. They thought they had him, of course. And anyway, you can see the different sizes in the armies. Hannibal's force was like 40, he might have had more than that, 40 to 50,000, I think is estimated, but it was almost half the size of what Vero and Paulus's armies were, basically. And what happened was Hannibal had a plan. He knew that the Romans were going to attack him in the center, because that's mostly what the Romans do in a lot of their military tactics. They would just use their Roman legions to just, bash you in the middle of your line. And so what Hannibal decided to do was he used a combination of infantry and cavalry, and he tried an encirclement movement, what they call a double envelopment. What he did was he put his mostly main infantry in the center here. Also on the edges, he brought in these pike forces. I don't know if you know about the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians still used like phalanx formations, like the Carthaginians, like the Macedonians did. They have these pike forces that they brought in with those sarissa they still used. And then using like mostly Spanish and Numidian type cavalry, he was able to attack them in the rear. as well. And so this whole thing eventually led to an encirclement movement that would, it's by the way considered one of the first major encirclement battles that was ever fought, probably in history, and done on purpose, more or less, they believe. Some people call it double envelopment as well. And the amount of forces that the Romans lost was ridiculous. It was somewhere between 40 and 50,000 men were killed in the battle on the Roman side. And then I think the amount that was, I forget how many that he had, but Hannibal lost some men too. So if you put that in there on top of that, you're looking at probably close to 60, 70,000 casualties, maybe, I think fought in the battle, that was in the battle itself, which I think was fought for a few hours. So that was considered, by the way, one of Rome's worst defeats. The Battle of Cannae, that and the Battle of Teutoburg Force that happened later, which I'll talk about at the beginning of the empire. I think the Romans lost like 30,000 men in that one as well. But the only thing about Hannibal was Hannibal could not defeat the Romans. That was the only problem he had. He just didn't have the men to really, he didn't have enough forces to really take Rome. Rome was a fortified city, more or less. And so he didn't have the siege equipment either. And so what ends up happening, the war drags on. Fabius, I think, came out of retirement. And basically the Romans went to more of a guerrilla style, scorched earth policy, fighting against Hannibal to defeat him in Italy. And that led to the war dragging on. So neither side could really, win the war in Italy. And it became kind of a stalemate, pretty much. Italy was devastated by the war also as well. So that's kind of what's going on, pretty much in the Second War at that point. Now, the Romans decided that wasn't working, fighting Hannibal, one-on-one, and all that in what is Italy. And so what the Romans decided a new strategy at that point, which a lot of it was a combination of the Roman Senate and this Roman general named Scipio. They often call it Cornelius Scipio Africanus. You see a statue up on the left there. Scipio was considered one of the greatest generals in the Punic Wars. In fact, he had a nickname. He was often called they called him the Roman Hannibal. So kind of like the opposite of Hannibal. And of course, the guy that would eventually defeat Hannibal by the end of the war. So he would become, Hannibal's rival. It's a debate about how they say his name. I think most people say Scipio. I've heard the other way they say it is Scipio. So it's kind of a debate about how they say the name. But Scipio, I think, is the common way. He's called like either Cornelius Scipio, but Africanus was a kind of a nickname or title they gave him later. It means the African. And he was called that because of, not that he's African, but that he won battles in Africa. So that's where he got the name. So what happened was, with the Romans fighting Hannibal in Italy, what Rome and the Senate decided to do, they decided that the best thing they're going to have to do is to go on the offensive elsewhere. And so one of the things that Scipio does is that he goes after Hannibal's base in Spain and try to attack that and seize that. And then after that, they're going to, of course, try to attack next into what is also Africa, where, the capital of the empire is of Carthage, Carthage itself, more or less. So using mostly the navy, Scipio crossed the sea there, up the upper part of the Mediterranean Sea. And so around the time, I think it's like 209 BC, they entered Spain. And Scipio would fight against one of Hannibal's brothers, whose name is Hasdrubal, who I think later died in the campaign. And by 206 BC, basically the Romans are in control of Spain. They take it over at that point. That doesn't get Hannibal out. He's still, fighting, pretty much in Italy at that point, living off the land. And so then Scipio, then from Sicily, using the Roman Navy again, then invades into North Africa, which I think he did about 204 204 is when they cross over. So I think in 203 BC, that forces eventually Hannibal to return, who eventually comes back by about 202 BC. And that ends up leading to a showdown, if you know about that, between Hannibal and Scipio, considered one of the greatest battles really in ancient times. Two, military geniuses, fight it out at the end. Happens in October of 202 BC. The Battle of Zama, which of course occurs in Tunisia, south of where Tunis is today. And so, this battle is important. The Battle of Zama is important because it pretty much, decides the outcome of the whole war. Like who's going to, control Spain pretty much, and really control everything in the Western Mediterranean after that. And that's why it's important about that later on. I'll come back to that in a second. And kind of talk about both sides. I'll kind of get into something that happened before the battle. That's very, very famous. Apparently, Scipio had been in awe of Hannibal, thought he was a great general, and he wanted to meet him, which is true. And so right before the battle, Scipio met Hannibal and tried to talk him into the surrendering. The war's over. It's pretty much over. I think we've pretty much won. Scipio thinks they pretty much have, I think, at this point. Hannibal still thought he could defeat Scipio. I think he may have had maybe a little bit larger force than Scipio did. Hannibal thought he could rely on his war elephants, which he had been amassing. And so when the battle took place, Battle of Zama, what occurred was the reason why Scipio ends up winning was Scipio had put more emphasis on the Roman cavalry, which is something that they'd been lacking before. And so with the Roman cavalry, they were able to help encircle Hannibal's forces. And then the Romans also figured out, since Italy, how to fight elephants. That they figured out was that they could just, when the elephants charged their legions, they could just part their ranks. They also learned that they could use trumpets, make a lot of noise, which would scare the elephants, and they would just go berserk and run off. And so elephants really became obsolete after the Battle of Zama. And Hannibal's force, half his force was killed and wounded, and the other half, I think another 20,000, was captured by Scipio. So he basically lost his whole army pretty much. And the war was, like I said, over after that. And so I said that the whole, that decided the war. And so, Rome ended up taking over Spain after that. Another possession they conquer it pretty much. And then Carthage is not a major power after that. In fact, I don't know why they fought the third one later, but I'll get into that later. But Carthage is forced to pay a lot of money back to the Romans, to all the war damages that were done mostly in Italy. So they had to pay high war reparations, which I think they paid off within 50 years or something like that. Hannibal and Scipio actually remained friends after the war ended, the Second War. And so I think actually Hannibal was put back in power afterwards. And I think Carthage was mostly run by an oligarchy, mostly ruled with Hannibal in charge. But what happened was after Scipio died, which was around 183, basically it forced Hannibal into exile. And so Hannibal eventually fled to the east, where he ended up, I think, fighting the Romans. I think he, for a while, helped out the Seleucid Empire that was also fighting the Romans as well. And so he fought with them a little bit before he actually committed suicide later, because I think he thought he might get captured by the Romans. And so Hannibal ended up killing himself in the end. So that was the Second Punic War, which I said, was the Second Punic War, of course, was the bloodiest of the three wars, pretty much. Now, let me go ahead and I will also talk about next a little bit the last one, which is the Third Punic War. That one, of course, it's not as well known as the second one, but it's obviously the second most famous of the wars. Here's another one right here showing the stats in the battle. You want to look at it later. But so the Third War really didn't have to happen, but the Romans were really fearful that the Carthaginians were going to make a comeback, like they did before at the First Punic War. And so fear of, Carthaginians coming back had a lot to do with, why the war broke out. Also, the Romans, it was partially greed too. The fact that the Romans saw it as an opportunity to take over part of Africa, from Morocco to part of Libya, which is where Carthage was. And so that was the other reason why they wanted to fight the Carthaginians again in a third war. And there was this Roman senator who was also at one point Roman consul. His name was Marcus Cato. They call him Marcus Cato the Elder, or also called Major, if you want to call it the actual name, Latin name, I guess, or Majorus, I think they called him. And he was one of the big backers, of course, of the whole war. He was a big war hawk, like my poetry there. Anyway, but yeah, but he was, a big backer of the war. And he became famous prior to the beginning of the war for his famous quote there, which you can see, Carthago delinda est, which means, of course, in Latin, Carthage must be destroyed. It's probably the most famous quote ever attributed to really the whole Punic Wars. And it came from a saying that, or a quote, I guess, that he would say in speeches that Cato would give. Cato was a really good orator or speaker. And apparently at the end of any kind of speech he was giving, like it didn't matter what he was talking about. He could be talking about, we need to cut taxes or raise taxes, or we need to deal with something with all the garbage in the city, whatever it is he's talking about that's important politically about the state. He would make a comment at the end, and he would say something, oh, by the way, I think Carthage must be destroyed. That's why you kind of sneak a comment in there. And so that became a very famous quote that he's known for. Hannibal, I think you can see it right there. The little rows are red, the legions deployed, Carthage must be destroyed. Like that. Anyway, so he was one of the big backers of it, and so eventually what happened to cause the war, there was a state called Numidia that was nearby in North Africa, in Carthage, and the two got in a kind of a conflict or something between each other. And so Carthage used it as a excuse to go in there again and declare war on them. And so what happened was in 149, the Romans invaded Africa again. And it led to a siege. Like the Carthaginians actually gave up. They were just going to, basically give up and surrender, but the Romans wanted to conquer the whole thing. And so it led to a long siege, the siege of Carthage, which would last almost 3 years, from 149 to 146. Part of why it lasted a long time was the Carthaginians heavily fortified the city from within. And so it took it had several generals trying to take it out. They couldn't do it. And finally they brought up this other general named Scipio Aemilianus, who was actually a grandson of Scipio. And he was the one that actually was involved in eventually of ending the siege in 146 BC. And eventually what happened, if you know about it, was Carthage was sacked and burned. It was destroyed. Like the whole thing was just wiped to the ground. They say the city burned for days. I think it's something, 7 days or like a week or so that it burned. And supposedly the city had supposedly had 500,000 people living there. That's what they say anyway, how large of a population it was. 80% or more of the population was wiped out, was killed, and the rest was all enslaved. That was left over. That's how bad it was. And of course, the ruins of Carthage are in Tunis now, on the outskirts of Tunis in what is Tunisia. Most of it is just a bunch of ruins, or just areas you can see which is not much left of it. there's actually a kind of an aerial view of what the ruins of Carthage looks like. And you've probably heard the legend about the fact that the Romans took salt. Well, they plowed it over first. They plowed the land first. And then they used salt, right? And salted the whole area so nothing would grow back and all that. But they think that that's actually not true. This is a made-up story that became very popular in what is modern times. Apparently, none of the ancient writers write about it or even mention about this whole issue, like of using salt and all that. And I believe the area we're talking about that they would have had to plow over in salt the earth would have been like 50 square miles. That's the whole area of like mostly where Carthage was. 32,000 acres, which is, probably ridiculous because salt was, expensive, and salt was even used to kind of pay some of the troops and all that. So that's probably not really a true story about that. But it makes a great story, thinking about it, that kind of thing. It even looks like salt. If you look at that's probably more of a black and white picture, but if you probably look at it from the air, like a colorized picture, it probably looks like salt, but it's not. It's sand you're looking at. Now, of course, what happened after that, the Romans then went on to, after the Punic Wars, they began conquering the whole Mediterranean Sea. Between the 2nd and the 1st centuries BC, they took over Greece, they took over Turkey, they took over Syria, and eventually Israel. They already took over territory eventually take over Morocco to Libya. And eventually in the 1st century BC, they'll take over the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. That'll be one of the last areas they conquer. Later they had Britain, the beginning of the Roman Empire. And Romans used to joke that the Mediterranean Sea was our sea, our Roman lake, which they called Mare Nostrum. And so pretty much it is. It pretty much is a Roman lake, for multiple centuries. I want to say up to close to almost the decline of the Roman Empire, 4th, 5th centuries. So for a long, long time, the Romans control it with their navy and all that, So that's pretty much, like that point, the Republic is, like I said, the Roman Republic is becoming an empire. You get down to the 2nd, 1st centuries overall. So the next thing I need to talk about, of course, today is also getting into the so-called decline of the Republic, which the decline of the Republic kind of occurs like between the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, when it becomes more like an empire. And over time, what's going to happen is the emperors will eventually seize power, more or less. So yeah, you got that happen. That next, of course, there's all kinds of different causes of why the Roman Republic declined. Of course, one of the main things I'll get into today that really causes it is you get the rise of these dictators that take over Rome, that seize power. These were mostly statesmen and Roman generals that became so powerful that it caused like numerous civil wars to break out. That's one of the things that will happen. They'll have civil wars, like a bunch of them, especially in the 1st century. There's multiple civil wars. And civil wars is kind of what leads to the foundation of the Roman Empire being created. And then you got these emperors that kind of emerge from that to take over as autocratic rulers. And the emperor evolved from the dictators that eventually seized power. And a lot of these dictators you may have heard of: Gaius Marius, Sulla, Julius Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, Octavian, Mark Antony. Those are all examples of different dictators that would eventually seize power over the Republic, which is, like I said, becoming an empire. Let me kind of go through a few today. I don't know if I'll be able to get through all the different dictators that take over the Republic today, but I'll go ahead and start talking about some of the ones that are famous. The first one I'm going to get into, of course, is Gaius Marius, who's, of course, well known. Actually was the uncle of Julius Caesar, by the way. So he's one of the first ones. I think that's off there on the bottom, but basically from the 150s to 86 he lived. And Marius, he's usually called for short, was mostly a political statesman. He was a Roman consul multiple times. In fact, he was actually Roman consul 5 years in a row, which is a record, mostly because he was a great general. In fact, he was a great military mind, one of the best generals since probably going back to Scipio and some of those other generals we've talked about in the Punic Wars. And Marius is part of why they think the Republic starts declining. It's really under him that they have the first civil wars break out. And so oftentimes Marius is kind of blamed for maybe the decline of the Republic, and then all these other dictators that come in later that you have also as well. One thing Marius is famous for, he's famous for what they call the Marian reforms. What were those? These were reforms where what they did was they began to professionalize the Roman army more. Before the armies were more volunteer, and it was often based on like your wealth status. I think they even divided the Roman armies into different classes. I think first through, I want to say all the way down to, I want to say fifth class or something like that. And so a lot of times the guys on the bottom, like the poorer classes, they'd put them up front to get killed first. Yeah, seriously. Anyway, what happened was he allowed anybody to enlist as long as they were a citizen, a male citizen of the empire. Actually, you see there on the bottom, that's actually what caused the Republic to decline. It really did, because what happens later is the Roman armies, if you know about it, become more loyal to the general rather than the state. And so it's almost like a mercenary type army that they have. These guys will do anything the commander says because he's got to pay them. The general pays them, not the state. The general even arms them. All their equipment and weapons and all that is something that Marius has to do, of course, to pay for it and all that. Marius also created one of the main fighting units of a Roman legion. I told you a Roman legion has about 4,800 soldiers or legionnaires in it. They have what they call a cohort. A cohort is a unit of a legion that has about 480 soldiers or legionnaires in it. And there's 10 cohorts in a legion. So 4,800 times 10 is 4,800, right? And then what happened was, you can see there on the bottom, they also would break down the cohort of 480 soldiers into what are a century, 6 centuries. And a century is 80 legionnaires. And of course, that's where you get the word centurion from, if you know about that, which is what they call a soldier that's part of a century. Oh, they even broke it down further than that. Century was broken down into what they call a contubernium as well, which I think has about, I think it's got 8 men in it. I think there's 10 contuberniums in a century. So I think they'd all live in a tent, the contubernium, basically. So like I said about the Roman armies, they were mostly, like I said, paid by the generals. They weren't, they weren't paid by the state and all of that. And so that's why the Romans were continuously fighting all these wars, trying to, get money from that to feed their armies, etc. And I guess all the slaves that they got too. Think of all the slaves that they, were able to acquire from all these conflicts and so on over time. You can see also that soldiers would often serve a 16-year term. And then after they would retire, they actually, after 16 years, they had to serve, I think, another 4 years in reserve. So you actually really served 20 years, more or less. Of course, a lot of people got killed before that probably ended, more or less. I think cavalry wasn't as long, though. Might have been like closer to 10 years, something like that. But those are all some of the reforms that Marius started doing as a Roman general. Now, what happened, though, was Marius eventually got this rival general that came in named Cornelius Sulla. And Sulla was a young and upcoming general that eventually would become better than he was over time. And what happened was it led to civil war. The two became like opposed to each other because both wanted to control, who's going to fight various wars. And like if a war would break out, the the Roman Senate would decide who would command the forces. And so at one point they gave like a commission to Sulla, which angered Marius. And so they end up in the Civil War starting around 88 BC. And what ends up happening was that they called it Sulla's Civil War, or Civil Wars. And it would drag on for like 5 or 6 years. It was considered one of the first of several civil wars that would rack the whole republic and help to cause the decline of it. And over time, Marius lost the civil war. Like Marius at one point was exiled from Rome and eventually died. And Sulla took control of the republic, actually marched his forces into the capital of Rome and was declared dictator, which he would for like 3 or 4 years, 82 to 79 or 78 BC, I think is how long he was dictator from. And so Sulla's kind of famous for reviving the dictatorship, which was very similar to the Greek tyrants that controlled the Greek city-states and all that. And so the dictatorship, is going to be the prototype position to the later Roman emperors over time, except Sulla stepped down. Yeah, I think he retired at one point. But I think Sulla said that one day that there would be a dictator that wouldn't step down, and he was right. And he was right about that. All right, so after Sulla retired, one of the things that happens next you study about with Rome. Rome eventually, they even have like these 3-man dictatorships that come about later, which is called a triumvirate, which means, I think in Latin, it means Greek, I think. 3 men rule. It's basically what it means. And they have one, of course, that's founded called the famous so-called First Triumvirate, which you see has 3 men in it, which are, of course, up there, Gnaeus Pompey, they sometimes probably call it Pompey Magnus or Pompey the Great, Marcus Crassus, and then Julius Caesar. They formed this pact together to control Rome, which they think is founded about 60 BC. It was kind of secretive somewhat. And talk about the first two on the left there. Pompey and Crassus were really, I think, a little older than Caesar, and they were more famous for being successful generals before Julius Caesar was. In fact, you study about Pompey and Crassus, they had been supporters of Sulla during the Civil War. And I'll get to the Spartacus revolt in a second. They were involved in that. But Pompey was supposedly the better general. That's what they say anyway. And then Crassus was a rich senator. In fact, they say Crassus was probably the wealthiest man in ancient times. He was like a billionaire. He'd be like Donald Trump today with a lot of money. And supposedly Crassus was the one that helped bankroll pretty much Julius Caesar's whole career because he had a lot of money. Those two generals became very, very famous by the 70s BC because of the Spartacus revolt. You may have heard of this revolt that broke out in Italy. And the Spartacus revolt was called the Third Servile War, and happened over about a 2-year period. And it was a very bloody revolt by slaves and gladiators that happened at the city called Capua, which is in southern Italy. And there was an ex-gladiator named Spartacus, and he revolted, and a bunch of gladiators and other slaves eventually joined up with him, and they began forming armies where they fought the Romans. This went on for like a year or two. And at one point, they actually defeated several Roman armies that were sent against Spartacus. He was apparently a pretty good military general. They should have hired him as a general. I don't know. And eventually, though, Crassus and Pompey eventually wiped out his forces. Kind of a debate about what happened to Spartacus, but Spartacus either was killed in battle or they crucified him. They're not sure about this, but they do know that 6,000 of his ex-soldiers, of course, were captured and they were crucified along the Appian Way between what is Rome and Capua. So the Spartacus revolt, of course, didn't work, you know. And those two guys became real famous, you know, basically because of it. Then Julius Caesar became famous too. Julius Caesar, like I said, I told you, was a nephew of Marius. He was a big supporter of Marius. Actually, Caesar's aunt had married Marius, and so he was mostly nephew by marriage. And but Caesar would go on to be one of Rome's greatest generals. He's considered probably one of the top 3 Roman generals, I would say, in Roman times. He was a great conqueror. If you know about Caesar, he would go on to conquer most of the whole Mediterranean basin and take control of the whole, you know, entire republic. And one of his greatest campaigns, if you know about it early on, was his conquest of Gaul, which is what they call France. That's a huge area between Germany and Spain that he would go into to last over like 6-7 years. And the Gallic Wars was pretty bloody too. I would say that was the second bloodiest probably war maybe in the Roman Empire Republic before they had the Pax Romana that occurs. Maybe 1 million casualties may have occurred, like 1 million dead or so. And I think they say that Caesar also captured about another 1 million slaves from this conquest. So Caesar conquered Gaul, which the Romans called France. And then also Caesar was the first Roman to cross the English Channel and invade Britain, going after some of the Gallic forces that fled into Britain. And so he actually did it twice. He invaded twice, crossing the English Channel. Caesar also crossed the Rhine River, actually built a bridge across it, and actually invaded into part of Germany. But like I said, the Romans were never that successful, really taking over Germany. It's kind of an isolated area, more or less. Of course, Caesar would go on to write historical works, of course, about his campaigns. I don't know if you know about Caesar. Caesar was a great orator. He was actually a writer, wrote historical works. And there's 2 works attributed to him. There's one called the Commentaries on the Gallic Wars. That's very well known. And these describe his campaigns, like each season when he was fighting against the Gallic tribes, you know, in Gaul and France. And it started making him like real famous back in Italy. The people were really starting to like Caesar. A lot of the lower classes really looked up to Julius Caesar. He was a man of the people. He was what they call a popularis man. A popularis man in Rome was a person that supported a lot of the lower classes and plebeians. And then those that were against the popularis are called optimates. And these were people that supported the wealthy people and patricians and the Senate and all that. And it's just kind of why he's killed later, Caesar, because a lot of the wealthier people didn't like Caesar because he was just too much of a man of the people and all that. So Caesar was really becoming a household name at that point. And he was a ladies' man. He had all kinds of, I think he was married, like I want to say 3 times at one point, but Caesar was a ladies' man. He had all kinds of mistresses and women, girlfriends all over the place. And there was even some kind of law that later passed when he was dictator that he could have any woman he wanted. And there was an old joke about Caesar that, what was it? Lock up your wives. Caesar's coming to town, they would say, more or less about him. So he was part of that triple-headed monster, you know, the so-called first triumvirate that they would have. But if you study about the first triumvirate, it didn't last forever. It eventually would break up, more or less. What happens, so I guess I have a few minutes left. I can kind of get into it a little bit, but it eventually breaks up. The first triumvirate actually broke up. One of the things that hold it together was a bunch of things holding together, more or less. I didn't really get into, but you got Crassus here, of course, like he's got all the money, right? And I'm talking about in the middle there. And Caesar and Pompey, part of why those two were together was Pompey had married Caesar's daughter. And so Pompey was actually the son-in-law of Julius Caesar. So it helps to kind of glue those two guys together. And then Crassus has all the money, I guess, for the ambitions of what they want to do with Rome. But what happened was Crassus, who thought he was a great general too, went off and campaigned in the east against the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire was this kind of like an Iranian state that formed in Iraq and Iran and part of Syria. And they were a big rival to the Romans in the east. They fought them for centuries. Anyway, he went over there, Crassus, and he got killed in battle, 53 BC. And what ends up happening, Pompey decides that he's going to switch. Pompey was actually just like Caesar. He was a popularis man. Well, guess what? He decided to switch over and become an optimate, to support more of the wealthier causes. And so Pompey basically joins the Senate, and the Senate basically declares Pompey like sole ruler of Rome at this point. And Caesar's still back in Gaul, fighting, trying to, conquer France and all that and stuff like that. And so this angers Caesar. He realized that, they want him to disband his army at this point and come home to Italy. And Caesar thinks that he's a dead man if he comes back at that point. And so one of the things that happens, of course, at this point is Caesar decides to declare war on Rome, and then he's going to invade Italy. This happens in January 49 BC. I'll talk more about it later, but that's basically going to lead to another civil war that's going to break out when Julius Caesar basically fights Pompey. Caesar's going to go on to conquer all the Republic. But we're going to see what happens next. Caesar is going to get assassinated in 44 BC. And that really helps to really end the Republic at that point. And then, of course, I'll get to Octavian. His nephew is going to come in, and his nephew Octavian is going to start the Roman Empire. So I'm going to pretty much on our next class on Wednesday, we're going to talk about the beginning of the Roman Empire. So that's pretty much what's coming up eventually, more or less. So that's probably it for today. Now, I did want to remind you, of course, going into Wednesday coming up in the rest of the week, don't forget about your second exam. Start working on that, by the way. You do have assignments coming up, which probably need to send announcements about that soon, but don't forget, I think you've got a third vocab coming up soon. I think what's that next week? I think it is. And don't forget, you have your book report coming up soon too, as well. So both those are coming up around the corner. We are getting close to the end of the semester. Not too many lecture days left. I don't think I've got too many days left. I want to say I've got 3 weeks left after this overall. So I'm going to cram in whatever I can on the Roman Empire, maybe Byzantine Empire. And if I have time to get in the Middle Ages, I will too as well, in the future. So that's it for today. I guess nobody's got any questions for me. But like I said, I am going to post this lecture up later on my YouTube channel. So, if you got any comments, questions about it, let me know. I don't care if you think it's stupid or whatever. Send me whatever comments, questions you got. You get bonus points for it anyway. So some of you haven't been doing that, but I guess you don't want to take advantage of it. But that's it for today. I hope y'all have a good week coming up. By the way, the election's coming up. If you're registered to vote, don't forget also to vote if you can tomorrow, if you haven't already done that. So that's it for today. Y'all take care, and I'll see you later.